Hello, and welcome to Broads and Books. I'm Amy.
And I'm Erin, and this is a special Broads and Books bonus episode.
Today on the Broads Talk Books With, we've got Sarah Weinman, author of The Real Lolita, Unspeakable Acts, and more.
I have recommended 3 of her books. 3.
Three?
That's a three-peat.
It's a very rare phenomenon.
Rare.
In the Broads and Books world.
Rare.
Yeah.
But she's the best at
She's
crime
the
writing.
best.
She's
Yeah.
just the best, so...
I will also tell our listeners that you messaged me the morning of this interview and said in all caps, "It's Sarah Weinman Day." And then there was a technological problem, which almost necessitated us rescheduling. And I saw your face crumple in real time, like you were holding on to this. Like this was what was going to make you get through your Monday.
I feel like that's true. Yeah, I was very pumped.
You were very
pumped.
pumped.
I had been really trying to downplay it, but I was pumped. I'd been pumped since we knew that it was going to happen.
Yeah.
So-
And this one, I sort of surprised you. I pitched her without telling you. And I think I'm glad I did, because I don't know if you would have been able to handle the couple days that it took for Sarah to get back and say yes.
No, I would have lost it.
Yeah.
I would have been like, we're the worst. This podcast has to stop. I'm pulling the plug right now.
But listen, you held your cool, and
Yes.
we found Sarah Weinman to be impossibly cool.
And not just because she called us the best kind of readers.
I mean, spoiler alert, that's what she does. She says it.
Yeah.
Says that to us. And I think you might get that engraved on your gravestone.
Yeah, I added that into my afterlife wishes.
Excellent.
So we put all the books that Sarah mentions in the show notes so you can add them all to your TBR pile.
And now here's our interview with Sarah Weinman.
Tell us a little bit about young Sarah. What was your reading like? What were your favorite books? Were you reading true crime then? What kinds of stuff was happening when you were a young reader?
Well, I think my introduction to true crime was in a very strange way, because I have this memory of being about 8 years old. And at that time, it was 1987 or thereabouts, so mid-'80s. And I was a huge baseball fan. I was growing up in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. And the closest team in proximity were either the Montreal Expos, which are no longer in existence, and the Toronto Blue Jays, which are, but I was more of an Expos person than a Blue Jays fan, even though I loved both. But I had this book in the house, and I think it's because my father was a baseball fan, my brother was a baseball fan, and it was the Baseball Encyclopedia. And it was this big, thick book, just full of stats and facts. And I know that Bill James, who is another sort of conduit between baseball and true crime, his books were in the house, and I was reading them as well. But I had this encyclopedia, and I just got it into my head to wonder, so if I'm looking up all this trivia about baseball players, I wonder how baseball players died. And because apparently I was already pretty morbid at that tender young age. So I'm leafing through and I'm accumulating various gruesome facts. And then at the dinner table, I decided to regale my family with them. And luckily my family was pretty chill about it, considering, but I was definitely not a, quote, neurotypical child, I think is a good way of phrasing it. But that wasn't the only type of book I was reading. I mean, some of the favorites that I still come back to that I loved in childhood were like the complete works of Lucy Maud Montgomery, and not just the Anne of Green Gables books, but also the Emily books and the Blue Castle and the many, many short story collections that came out decades after her death that were being published right around the time when I was reading them. So I loved them for story. I loved them for character. I couldn't have articulated that as a middle schooler, but certainly now looking back, I totally see why I love them and why they still hold up for me. And then I was reading just a lot of YA and so if we really want to go back, then Sweet Valley Twins, Sweet Valley High, Babysitter's Club.
Did you get into like Christopher Pike or any of the sort of?
I read some of those, yeah. And R.L. Stine before he did Goosebumps, because at the time, Goosebumps hadn't even begun yet. So he
Yeah.
was just doing, well, Fear Street was Christopher Pike, but, whatever. I think he did like a haunted roller coaster book I remember reading. And yeah, so this was back in the day when I'd just be like, here are these authors with cool names. And then I don't think I've ever met Pike, but I have met Bob Stein on a couple of occasions, including very randomly backstage at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, because it turned out we were both fans of this jazz pianist, Ethan Iverson, who is a huge crime fiction nerd. And if you go to his site, do the math, he's done these incredibly detailed essays on a variety of crime writers, including Donald Westlake and Lawrence Block and Ross Thomas, and I think most recently Charles Willeford. So yeah, random connections, but this is the way it sometimes is in New York City. Anyway, all of which is to say, my reading was a little more, maybe not traditional, but just it was definitely in sort of middle school YA. I have to also mention like Norma Klein, who was a big influence, even more so than say Judy Blume. Mm-hmm. And then around 15, 16, I started reading mystery novels. Mary Higgins Clark, Edna Buchanan, Walter Mosley were big ones. But it wasn't really until I got to college that I really started becoming a serious mystery reader.
Mm-hmm. I'm just picturing your parents' face when you sat down. I'm still on that. Where you're
no, you should be.
How these baseball players died?
I don't know what that says about me as a parent, that I would be delighted if my kids came to the table and were like, this is how these people died. I'd be like, that is amazing. Tell me more.
I feel like I can relate to your parenting style. I'm not a parent, but I do wonder sometimes if I ever would, how I would deal with a child who just was like, guess what I've just learned? And I hope I would have the same grace that my own parents did.
I could definitely see that, Aaron. You'd be like, tell me about the murder.
I would be. I'd be like, I'm all in. Let me give you some more books. Mm-hmm. Well, we've talked about a couple times on the podcast, classics that we struggled with and we've heard from people that maybe that impeded their reading life early on. They were presented with something maybe too soon or something that didn't speak to them. Do you remember a classic that you struggled with?
I don't know about a classic, but I think it's a little tricky to talk about it in light of the recent news. But one of the things that I've been involved with over the last few months is this reading group of other women writers, and we're all reading Philip Roth. And so when I was in my teens, and it sort of ties into how I first read Lolita as well, because I sort of made this almost jarring shift from middle grade books, YA, into reading books for adults. And in high school in Canada, the curriculum that we had was a little bit different than maybe curricula in south of the border. So the book, I would be reading authors like Margaret Lawrence, and that's Laurenc, The Stone Angel, The Diviners, books like that, Margaret Atwood, Alice Munro. And I remember we were doing some independent study work, and I just had a notion to read books that sounded controversial. So one of them was Lolita, and that's how I ended up eventually down the path that begat what became the Real Lolita a few years ago in the story of Sally Horner. But soon afterwards, I started reading Philip Roth, and I read Portnoy's Complaint at 16, which was very jarring and eye-opening. But it's like, no, I couldn't stop there. I had to start reading some of the then recent work. So this is the mid-1990s. So his two most recent novels at that point were Operation Shylock and Sabbath Theater. And having recently reread them for this book group, the first thing I thought was, what the hell was I thinking to try to read these books at 16? I had no conception of anything, let alone, and it's not even just content, it's just in terms of structure and form and what he was trying to do. And obviously the levels of internalized and externalized misogyny that are very much present and I think need to be grappled with. But I had no facility for that at 16. And I don't think any 16-year-old should. So revisiting those books, I see them with very different eyes now. But obviously now I think there are these other more difficult conversations to be asked about transforming, I mean, I keep coming back to this of just transforming life into art and blinkered perspectives and whose stories are worth telling and whose get kicked in the boot. So I think just with the larger question of classics, it's also, I wonder how much of a disservice teens have with certain books that they're being exposed to them in such a way of, you must read them, they are classics, as opposed to, these books are pretty fun. And if you feel like you're sort of coming at them in a way that doesn't feel like homework, maybe they'll be more interesting to read. But also coming back to classics when you're older that you may have read when you were younger, you do have a greater appreciation, or you can, but you can also be like, no, these books were terrible. Why were they being shoved down my throat? Or, oh, wow, now I totally get why they were taught. And I wish I had been able to see that when I was in my teens, but how could I, because I was a teen?
Mhm.
That's such a great point, that even the way that they choose the classics for that age group is problematic. Like, some of the things that we were reading at that age,
Yeah.
we had no context for, but also like, should we be reading this?
And if we are reading this, why are there no contextualized discussions? And some of that I think may have to do with the limitations of the teachers who are teaching them.
Mhm.
Definitely.
I mean, the best teachers are those who are learning alongside their students. And certainly the best teachers I had were doing that as well. And I feel like that's just the larger context to look at all of this stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, as you were reading, things that you enjoyed, things that you were testing yourself with, like those kinds of books, were there particular authors and books that made you want to be a writer?
I guess the answer is reading crime fiction that was contemporary around the late 1990s, early aughts. And I didn't really think of myself as a writer for some time, even though looking back, like the first short story I ever had published was the long ago online magazine Plots with Guns. They published something I wrote in 2003, which if I look back, I just, anything you write in your 20s is kind of inherently embarrassing. So I take that in the necessary stride that I have to. But this goes back to what I was saying, that when I went in Canada, we call it university. So when I went there, and I was reading pretty widely, but the crime fiction that I really gravitated towards were writers like Laura Lippman and S.J. Roseanne, Michael Connolly, Dennis Lehane, Harlan Coben, Sarah Paretsky, Sue Grafton, and so on and so forth. Just writers who were doing not only detective fiction, but it felt like they were writing about society in a way that made sense, that it was trying to understand how the world worked. And I felt like the only way that I could make sense of the world was through a crime fiction lens. And then a little bit later, there would be a true crime lens as well. But really, in terms of who made me want to be a writer, it was just like, it's just constantly reading. And just the more books that I read and the more widely I read, the more I could sort of take what seemed to be working, what didn't seem to fit my own sensibility, just trial and error and the like. And a lot of it was also when I started my old blog, which had the fanciful title of Confessions of an Idiosyncratic Mind, for reasons that frankly I no longer fully remember. But it was, again, 2003, and it was during that time when literary blogs were kind of a thing. I mean, I really started it because I loved crime fiction, and I didn't know of any other blog that covered the genre in the way that I wanted to see it covered, even though there are other blogs that covered various literary fiction or publishing types in a way. So I was sort of, how do I do something that's comparable to that? And it sort of coincided with me. So the other thing I should mention is that from fall of 2001 to spring of 2003, I was living in New York for the first time. I went to graduate school. I eventually got a master's degree in forensic science, which I guess also was a good training ground for being a writer, even though I was in deep denial at the time. I really thought I was going to be a scientist, and that didn't quite work out.
I would have never guessed that, but it makes so much sense now after reading your books. That forensic science background has to have come in handy a few times.
I do feel like studying science and particularly studying forensic science was good training ground for being a writer, because I feel like it helped with seeing the bigger picture, with understanding why crime happens, and also the limitations of investigation, and why television shows generally are completely false and have to compress the timeline and just everything that's going on. So yeah, there are a lot of different things in the primordial soup that made up my eventual career path, which I still don't fully think is a career path. I often described it as a series of happy accidents that led me towards where I am now. But of course, that's both true and not true. I mean, I worked hard. I had a lot of advantages, obviously, and ultimately it came down to, I think I figured out how to do stuff in a way that nobody else was, and that's part and parcel of the way my brain works. That I just think of things in a way that if other people do, they haven't necessarily articulated in the way that I've wanted.
Well, shifting a little bit now, thinking about your reading life now, how many books would you say are on your to be read pile? And are there a few you can share?
So regrettably, the answer is a little bit more complicated now, ever since I took on the crime gig at the New York Times Book Review. And so that,
oh my God,
my
you
first
must be inundated. Yeah.
Certainly the publicist's emails have increased a lot. I rely pretty heavily on NetGalley. So the to be read pile is large, but it's all contained within my iPad. So it doesn't at least feel like the shelves are teetering with galleys. And that's also deliberate, because I want to have as wide a choice as possible in terms of determining which books I would like to consider for the column. But I also don't want to necessarily tip my hand. And I feel like with NetGalley, I can just be like, okay, publishers auto approve me and I'll just pick and choose what I want. That's sort of the ideal world. It doesn't always work out that way, but at least a number of publishers have gone along with this request, and hopefully more will as well. But what it means is that it used to be on Twitter and Instagram that I could talk a little bit more freely about books that I was reading, but if they're for work, I really can't.
Oh,
so
I didn't even think about that.
Secret reading life.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not the first time. I've had crime fiction columns before, and I felt a similar thing where I just felt it wasn't right to talk about work reading. But what I do try to talk about are books that either are a little bit older or that have nothing to do with the genre. So for example, I think the last non-work book that I read was Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe, which I loved.
Yeah.
And is
on my list. Yeah.
Yeah, it's infuriating, and as one would expect. And the novel that I loved and that I just keep recommending to people, and in a different book group that I'm in, we just read it, was Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, the debut novel that came out in January. So that's a novel that I felt was really eye-opening, wonderfully written, and frankly, just a great comedy of manners. Just great, really great characters and realistic situations and the feelings, like all the feelings. It's like you don't have to be trans to relate to this. It's just these are. But obviously, if a column has run, I can talk about books that I particularly liked and heartily recommend.
So among those maybe that you've reviewed somewhat recently, have there been really big surprises that stick out to you? Things that really knocked your socks off?
In the first column, I think the book that I was most affected by was You Up by Katie DeSabato.
I just started that today.
Did you really?
Oh, we're really in sync here.
Got it from the library.
Yeah, I thought it was just a wonderful examination of friendship and expectations and loss and grief in a way that felt really fresh and formally interesting to me. And also in that same column, I love reviewing books where I'm entertained and I feel like I'm just having fun, because we're still in a pandemic. Like
Yes.
we need fun in our reading life.
Yes.
Mhm.
And I've been really enjoying the sort of maybe not resurgence, but just the transformation of the cozy mystery, that it's a little more millennial and a little more diverse. And so in the most recent column that ran, I really enjoyed Dale for Aunties by Jessica Sutanto, which published last week. And it's just about this girl who has aunties, and she's on the worst date from hell that ends with him dead, and they've got to figure out what to do with the body. And it's this whole like Weekend at Bernie's vibe with your family. It was just it was really fun.
I could take
and
that.
I so enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or Jonathan Ames's A Man Named Doll, which is the first in a very idiosyncratic PI series. And I've read pretty much all of Ames's work, be it nonfiction or fiction, or watched Bored to Death. And I love the fact that he's just finally admitted to himself, yes, I'm a crime writer and I love this genre and I want to stay in it. Mm-hmm. And I just felt like, yes, this is great. Do more of this. I'm along for the ride.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, I forgot it was your turn, Erin. Go for it. I got so wrapped up. I was like, I just want to keep talking.
Well, so you get a lot of books sent to you, you're getting a lot of requests, but if you're going to read something outside of work, what usually grabs your eye? Like, how do you come across books?
Oh, that's always a good question. I think my favorite way is just getting the random unsolicited book that somehow magically speaks to me. And so that's completely unfair because for any publicist listening to that, that's a tall order. So
just give me something magic that speaks to me.
But I think that's also why I love smaller presses like, say, New York Review of Books Classics. And, full disclosure, they asked me to do an introduction for one of my favorite reissues, Basic Black with Pearls by Helen Weinswag, a Canadian writer. And I love that book that I described as an interior feminist espionage novel.
Whoa.
And it was first published in 1981. And then Classics republished it a few months before the Real Lolita came out. But they also published a book last year that was my favorite novel of 2020. I read it 3 times, and frankly, I could reread it like all the time. It's called Divorcing by Susan Taubus. And it does have a tragic backstory because Taubus, who is an intellectual, she was married to a Jewish professor named Jacob Taubus. They had children. They had what seemed like a grand romance, and then it just completely disintegrated. And she both loosely fictionalized it, but also delved into her own family trauma of immigration and separation in this book. And it's very like fanciful, and it kind of draws on Yiddish literature. But within a few weeks of publication, she drowned herself. And Susan Sontag, who was her best friend, found the body off the coast of Long Island.
Oh my God.
So she never wrote another novel, and it just disappeared until New York Review of Books Classics reissued it. And I just read this and I was like, this book is made for me and I don't fully understand it, so I better read it again. And then I read it again and I understood it a little bit more, but I had to read it again. And that's kind of where I'm at, where things are further revealed on reread, which is, at the older I get, the platonic ideal for novels, that the best ones really, you don't just want to read them once, you want to read them at different stages of your life. And I hope to keep doing that. But of course, with all the books that there are out there to reread, there's still so many more to read.
Yeah, it's a tough decision with what you spend your time on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for Broads and Books, Erin here has recommended 3 of your books. You're the sole three-peat.
You are.
It's a true honor and a privilege, and I'm sort of staggered by that. So thank you.
Well, so we were wondering if there, obviously different topics. There were the Real Lolita, Unspeakable Acts, Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives. And so I know it runs a gamut, but do you think there's any particular books or authors that inspire your true crime writing?
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. And of course, I had been a longtime fan, admirer, and I'm glad to call him a friend now. But I read that book, and I don't often have this reaction of just being like, damn it, how do you do that? Because most of the time when I read books, I can see how writers do that.
Yeah.
And either it's something that I would like to do or something that I'm glad they did, but it's not really for me, or it's something I might not want to do at all. But in this case, I just was like, wow, I just want to know how you pulled that all off. And that's phenomenal. I cannot wait for Pamela Koloff's upcoming book. Her long form journalism is truly the best in the crime space, just consistently.
Mm-hmm.
And really just any writer who's collected in Unspeakable Acts, I've probably been a longtime admirer, or if not, then I am excited to see what they do in the future in addition. And then just try to keep reading other wonderful crime novels in addition. And luckily I have the means and the wherewithal and the perch to do that, which is, again, something I never, ever, ever want to take for granted.
Mm-hmm.
And, you review for the Times, there is a tremendous amount of responsibility that comes with that gig.
Another question that occurred to me, sorry, Erin, but
you're fine.
When you were talking that for a while, you were really focused on crime fiction and potentially thinking about that kind of, where did the shift happen where you went, obviously you're still reading fiction, but where you focus your writing on nonfiction?
I think it started about 10 or so years ago. And that was just a function of, at that point, like 2010, 2011, I had done a lot of reviewing of crime novels. And I'd also, I think, started to reach the end of the line of my old blog where I felt like I was just burning out. And in tandem, I had just taken on a job, which I would stay at through the end of 2018 as a publishing reporter for Publishers Marketplace. So that was a full-time job for a while. And that also was a job that entailed reading a lot of books and sort of being privy to what's coming up and forthcoming stuff. So I have like this available knowledge, not only of crime fiction and crime nonfiction, but also of how the publishing industry works. And so what ends up happening is that everything kind of bleeds into everything else. And so even my writing life, it's not so much that I do one thing and then something else and then something else. It's sort of very fluid in how I approach things. And so really it was just, I get restless and I want to challenge myself and I wanted to do some more reporting. And so I had done a cover story for the Philadelphia City Paper all the way back in 2007 on a still unsolved mystery called, colloquially known as The Boy in the Box. And in 1957, this young boy in Philadelphia whose name is still not known, his body was found in a box. And he had clearly suffered malnutrition and abuse. And it was a big mystery of who was this boy. So I looked into it and I talked to various retired cops and went around. And I look back and I think, I'm glad I did this, but knowing what I know now, I would write such a better story.
Oh, wow.
But I'm still super grateful that the editor in question, who was actually at the time the crime writer, Dwayne Straczynski, I emailed him one day and said, 50th anniversary of this is coming up. Can I write about it? And he's like, oh yeah. So we figured it out. But it really wasn't for another few years when I wrote a story of a different type of missing persons crime case. And it was the story of a chess prodigy in New York City who had vanished in the late 1970s, and his name was Peter Winston. And he had been written up in various magazines as a little boy for being a boy genius. And I found other connections culturally, like when he was 12, he helped start an alternative school, and all the kids banded together and there was a book. So I have this book, and two of the kids were the sons of the poet Adrian Rich. So she contributed a couple of pieces to this book as a parent. It's an amazing document, but unfortunately, Peter suffered from schizophrenia and other mental health issues. And I believe that contributed to why he disappeared. So it's it's a sad story, obviously, but it was also a way for me to figure out what was happening in the sort of subculture of chess.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first long form story that I felt like super proud of. And that led to a piece that I wrote for the New York Times Magazine about a crime writer who had just won a private detective novel contest and was and still is serving a life sentence for felony murder. And after that, that's when I started embarking on the long form piece that eventually became the Real Lolita.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So that was a long period then of working on the Real Lolita.
Yeah,
and maybe
because
even starting when you were 16 and first read the
Yeah.
book.
I mean, stories tend to gestate a long time. I mean, my next book, which will be out in February, I started work on that in basically as soon as the Hazlitt piece that was called The Real Lolita also, that was published in November of 2014. And I thought that this was going to be my next piece for Hazlitt. And for a number of reasons, I realized that this really was a book project, but I needed to write the book that became The Real Lolita and edit the collection that became Women Crime Writers and eventually edit the collection that became Unspeakable Acts and in tandem work on this. So now it's getting ready and along its path for publication.
That's exciting.
I was gonna say, Erin, you gonna mark that in your calendar? Just
Already did. Already done. Well, I'm sure I'm trying to keep my fan interaction really chill today. But what is one of your most memorable fan interactions?
Oh gosh. I think one that I cherish is the late lamented book festival. It was an outdoor festival called New York is Book Country. And it was 2000. And I flew from Ottawa to New York. I hadn't moved to New York yet for the first time, let alone permanently. But I just wanted to go to this book festival. And it was all along Fifth Avenue, and there were stalls from various bookshops and other stores. So I remember visiting the Mysterious Bookshop stall and meeting various authors there. And at the time, there were 4 mystery bookshops in New York City, not just one. So I met other authors at the Black Orchid stall and Partners in Crimes. And so when I moved back for grad school, I also worked 1 day a week at Partners in Crime. So I was a bookseller. So that was really my first exposure to authors and the business. And yeah, so I got to meet all of my favorite crime writers. And now I feel lucky that I can count some of them as my friends. But I also remember at a different New York is Book Country, I think it was the first time I met Donald Westlake, who he's been gone now for almost 13 years. But to me, he's such a vivid presence in my mind because as Westlake, his work could be so funny when he was writing the Dortmunder novels or some of the standalones. But as Richard Stark and the Parker novels, they're so lean and they're so mean. And I was so happy to meet him. And, we didn't really say much. It was just like the typical fan interaction of me just being like, I love your book, Dancing Aztecs. How did you do that? And he just was like, thank you. But I think eventually I think I got a little bit jaded as a bookseller just because I would meet authors all the time, or not so much jaded, but just these are writers and eventually some of them will become my friends. But I think it's really important to cherish those interactions. And when fans have met me, I'm so grateful that people are reading my work that I never want to take that for granted either, because they could be reading anything else. There's so many books to choose from, and they chose mine. And it's so important to just never forget that.
What are true crime fans like? Do they come at you hard? Do they are there emails? Are there cornering at reading events?
I feel like if there are, I have not been privy to most of it.
Perfect.
When I was on tour for the Real Lolita, I met a number of true crime podcast fans. And most of them were just really excited. It's like, oh, you wrote the Real Lolita, or I'm so excited to read your book. And when Unspeakable Acts came out, obviously because of the pandemic, no one was doing any touring. But even just seeing what people were saying on Bookstagram or people chiming in at virtual events, and it's all to me additive in a good way. So I think it's just that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a couple, but were there particular authors, as you got further into your career that you really wanted to meet, and you got to meet them and it was a good experience?
I mean, I mentioned that New York is book country, and I met Laura Lippman, and we weren't friends then, but eventually we did become friends. And it's just like I've already read her forthcoming novel, Dream Girl, and I'm so excited for the world to read it. It's I love what she was doing, and I'm proud of that book. Cool. And this is where, now reviewing crime fiction again for me feels like I've come full circle, because when I first had a regular book reviewing gig, it was at the Baltimore Sun, and I remember getting this box of galleys, and I saw this yellow galley by an author I'd never heard of, but it had a great title called Die a Little. And I thought, ooh, this sounds like fun. It's feminist 50s noir. I want to read this. And I read it and I loved it. And it was Megan Abbott's first book. And I reviewed it. And then as happened, we exchanged emails, and eventually we met for a drink, and we bonded over unsolved true crime. So she's also just great, and the turnout's going to be out in August, and that's another one that I'm excited for people to read. And obviously awesome. I won't be reviewing them for the Times, which is fine, because I think they'll get the reviews that they'll get the coverage that is like far lengthier than what could fit in my own column. But they're great people, and they're amazing writers, and it's like, wow, that's good.
How would you say that your reading life has changed since you became a published author, or even since you started the New York Times column?
I mean, since I started on the column, I'm just reading a lot more contemporary crime fiction again. I had sort of stepped away from it for a few years, partly because I needed a break, partly because I needed to be reading books that related to the ones that I was working on, partly because I was a little more immersed in reading nonfiction, and still am. And I think ultimately it comes down to just having as wide a reading diet. And this is where my ability to read fast is also helpful, because I'm glad I can do that, because I want to be able to not only read widely, but also read as much of the genre that I can, because then I feel like I have a much more informed opinion about what's going on and what's working or what isn't. But I also feel like as an author, I read with a lot more compassion and generosity. Like having this review gig now, as opposed to when I first started reviewing books in, say, 2003, 2004, it's not just age, it's not just wisdom, it's just more experience. It's many more books that I've read that I can draw on for comparison and for understanding. Also, having edited anthologies of crime fiction, just understanding the history of it and who gets elevated and who gets overlooked, who gets neglected and who gets exalted. So these are all questions that I think a lot about, and that inform the way that I read contemporary crime books, be they fiction or nonfiction.
That's a great way of putting it. I think we've been thinking more deliberately about that as well, after reading books like yours and after just understanding where we are in the world. And it makes for a richer experience.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think across all the reading that you've done, recent, past, whatever, do you think that there's a book or an author that everyone should read?
I mean, I will always recommend Dorothy B. Hughes' In a Lonely Place, because it's my favorite crime novel of all time. It's collected in Women Crime Writers. I mean, it was always going to be in there, but I just remember making a particularly passionate argument for it being in there. It was published in 1947. It became the basis for the 1950 film starring Humphrey Bogart and Gloria Graham. But the film is quite different, because Bogart's character also named Dick Steele, he's accused of murder, but he didn't, it's not clear until the very end. There's a real question of, but most likely it's like he didn't do it. And there are, issues of trauma and frankly PTSD that are happening in the film. But in the book, Dix is a killer and he is responsible for the murders of multiple women. But because we're in his head in the third person, we as the reader know much more about what's going on than he does. And I love the way that Hughes does this. And also that even in the midst of his incredibly blinkered psychopathic perspective, the women characters, especially his love interest, the actress Laurel Gray, and Sylvia, the wife of the detective who is Dix's army buddy, who is investigating the murders, they're the characters who shine, and they come through in the end, and they're the real heroines. And so there is so much going on, not just from a character standpoint, but also from a post-World War II toxic masculinity, men coming back and not knowing their place in the world. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's the inflection point for everything about crime fiction in America in particular. And it's like, if you read that, you understand everything. I would say it's a skeleton key to understanding American crime fiction.
Wow. Well, we're going to be buying some books after this.
Yeah, I know.
Mm-hmm.
That one's also New York Review Books Classics, and Megan Abbott wrote the intro for that. Everything kind of connects.
Yeah. I like it. Well, at the end of our podcast, we always talk about some pop culture thing we're obsessed with, whether that's music, movie, TV show, podcast. Do you have a current pop culture obsession?
Oh gosh, I feel like I'm so middle-aged that what is pop culture to me these days? But I do try to stay ahead on true crime podcasts. Yeah, I said this in a column and it's still true. It's like, I feel like that's an occupational hazard for me. I know that we're recording on Monday, May 3rd, and on Tuesday, May 4th is the last episode of The Line, which is a podcast that's hosted and produced by Dan Taberski. If you know his name, it's because he's responsible for the podcast Missing Richard Simmons and Headlong and Running from Cops, which I adored. So The Line, which is about the court-martial trial of Eddie Gallagher, I really did not think I was going to be into this at all. And it's a companion podcast to this documentary that Alex Gibney oversaw. But it's great because he does the work and it's so well written. And it had a legitimate Perry Mason style twist in the most recent episode. And now I'm like, I want to know what's going on in the last episode. So it's supremely well structured. And I so admired that, because the problem with a lot of true crime podcasts is that it's either they're just kind of lazy and they don't do the work, or they're exploitative, or they just aren't well written. Mm-hmm. And I'm picky, and I think it's good to be picky. So I'm glad for this one. I also just, Perennials or You're Wrong About, which is co-hosted by Sarah Marshall and Michael Hobbs.
Yes.
They just dropped an episode today about the Dixie Chicks, and it's it's super, super well done. And then another one that I enjoy for storytelling purposes is called Crimes of the Centuries. It's hosted by Amber Hunt, who at her day job, she does Accused, which is a great long form podcast. But because of the pandemic, they couldn't really work on that. So she, from home, has been doing the storytelling podcast of once famous crimes. And she's a great researcher, and she's good structurally, and she is, has a wonderful narrative. And I enjoy that. It's like the first thing that I listen to on Monday mornings now. So
cool.
Do you get into much docuseries, HBO kind of documentaries, long shows, that kind of stuff? Or do you prefer podcasts?
It's funny. I thought that with the pandemic, I'd be watching more TV. Mm-hmm. I watched a lot less TV.
Really?
I think it's because when I'm watching something, it's almost like it's too much for my brain. I can handle text and audio pretty well. but add the visuals and it's almost like it does something to my brain. So I feel like it's very easy for me to get overwhelmed watching television. And then I just feel like I get distracted a little bit more. So I haven't, but that doesn't mean I don't rule it out. Like I still want to watch Allen versus Pharaoh. I still want to watch a whole host of docu-series, and I will just try to at some point in some future. But also if I don't, that's okay too.
It's totally okay. And I can get that. Like some of the things that we've watched, because there's the visual and the audio, it's a lot. There's a lot happening. Yeah.
Although I will fully disclose that I watched everything on the PDF that was with the Unspeakable Acts.
Okay.
The entire resource list. Every time we got something done, I was like, here's another one. Here's another one. Keep going.
That's why it was there. So it wasn't just that you had the baker's dozen of pieces, but also much more supplemental books and articles and stuff to watch and stuff to listen to.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. It's just that if it's in the back matter of Unspeakable Acts, then I definitely endorse it.
Yeah. Well, it was a really good supplement because all those things went with something in there, it reminded me of that. And I think the viewing experience was better for it. I think if I had watched some of those things separate, I might not have gotten the same kind of feeling out of it. So
yeah. I didn't realize there was a syllabus in that too, Erin. Oh my God.
I know. I've been working my way through it. I've been sliding those in on the podcast and you just haven't noticed.
Sneaky. You've been trying to get Sarah's attention this whole time.
Yeah.
I get
I'm
it
just
now.
watching everything.
Okay. Yeah. Well, those were our questions, Sarah. Thank you so much for spending some time with us, for telling us what you've been thinking about and reading and some of your experiences. We really enjoyed it.
I'm so grateful that you asked me to be on and that you're reading my work so closely. And just thank you both. Like you're the platonic ideal of what readers ought to be. And it's not just in terms of my work, but like how you talk about books generally on the podcast. It's so great to see. And
wonderful to hear.
I look forward to what your thoughts are in future episodes with books that you're looking forward to. So
yeah.
Erin.
A delight.
A delight.
Yes.
So, I mean, that happened. We talked to Sarah Weinman. Your rare three-peat recommendation. And how do you feel right now?
I feel elated.
Okay.
I still am riding the high of that. I will for the entire probably year. I was going to say month, but I'm just going to give it a good year.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah.
I also, one of the things that I took from that is that I desperately want my kids to be like her. Because her coming to the table and just talking about murder.
I think it would make you the happiest you've ever been as a mom.
Yes.
Yeah.
Success. Other people, that might be a red flag. For me, success.
It also felt good because I don't know about you, but I remember doing stuff like that as a kid. And so it was like, oh, that's awesome.
That tracks.
That, our parents didn't commit us right away at that point.
Yeah. Kudos to them.
So good job.
Letting that grow.
And maybe you knew this because you are a big Sarah Weinman fan. I didn't know she had a graduate degree in forensic science, that she had thoughts of going into that scientific field.
Yes.
And instead, writing got its grips in her.
I love it.
Yeah.
And I have to say that having that knowledge now makes a lot of sense because she has such a ability to tell the story from so many angles, which is what makes crime writing great, is not just telling the story. People I think mistake crime writing, or even whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is you just tell the story and the story is the thing that gets the readers. It's not, especially now, because that market is starting to get so much more popular. It can almost be flooded.
Yeah.
And I think really true great crime writing is being able to look at it from so many angles to make the reader feel involved on whatever level, and knowing that she has that background just makes so much sense.
Yeah. Did you know that she was the crime book reviewer at New York Times?
Well, I did, only because I follow her on social media. So when she announced it, I did know that.
See, I should have known that you know that, because I imagine you stalk her in the way that we are allowed to stalk people in 2021. Yeah. Okay, great.
Mm-hmm. Not in any like creepy way, just in like a, hey, is a new book coming out kind
right,
of
not
way.
in a true crime way, but in a like, I love you and I want to see what you're doing these days.
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That seems like an area well suited to her.
Yeah. It's perfect. And who better to be recommending them, in my opinion,
exactly,
and reviewing them.
Yeah.
It was great for me that she was excited about the three-peat of recommendations.
Yes.
Because that's a rare honor.
It is a rare honor, and she took that honor in the way she should have taken it, with great delicacy and with acknowledging your love.
Yes.
It was wonderful.
Took it as the compliment it is meant to be.
I like that, when we were asking her about pop culture, she mentioned true crime podcasts, especially the fact that she's very picky about them. I also was intrigued by the fact that she doesn't really like, I don't know if I want to say doesn't like, but TV, docuseries, that kind of stuff. Sometimes it can be too much, which I totally understand. Sometimes there are, there's a little too much gore. There's a little too much, salaciousness. And it was intriguing to hear that sometimes even a crime writer such as herself has to protect her own sort of, well-being.
Well, and her book, Unspeakable Acts, which I think I mentioned in the episode, comes with a whole resource list of other things that she thinks are terrific, like other books, podcasts, movies,
the
docuseries.
Syllabus. You completed the syllabus.
I did. And I would say that that's a great place, especially for people who do feel that way. Like, I don't just want the run-of-the-mill kind of gory, or maybe it's too much. I mean, the stuff that she put in there really added to what you read in that book, or really made you think about something different. I really enjoyed everything that I took from that. So she definitely has a keen eye, which is yet another reason why she's in a perfect position at New York Times, for sure.
Excellent. And again, Erin, she praised us as the ultimate readers.
Yeah.
And I mean, you are obviously a much bigger fan than I, just because you've read more of her.
Yeah.
Even I myself was just like, oh,
yeah,
I feel good. I feel validated. I need to just remember that. Like, we need a soundbite for it that we, send ourselves every once in a while. Like, how we were sending ourselves the Book Smart dancing GIF over and over?
Yes.
We need to do a clip of Sarah Weinman calling us the ultimate readers.
See, I think that we do, because that rest of that week went a little sideways for me. And I mentioned that to you multiple times. Like, the thing getting me through this week is remembering, because there's nothing else I would like to be complimented more for than being the ultimate reader.
It is honestly validating, because we have a very light tone at the beginning of our episodes, but then sometimes we get deep. We talk about all the different aspects of the books, so it's good to hear.
You can call me a shitty parent, but you better know that my reading is on point.
Glad to know your priorities, and happy to be with you along the ride.
Good.
Excellent. Well, we will be back next Wednesday with a regular weekly themed episode.
In the meantime, happy reading.